The Mafia boss bit me by mistake at the Masquerade. Now he's hunting the woman behind the mask. I should have known a night that started with a borrowed mask would end with my blood on someone else's mouth. The Vesperi estate hadn't hosted the Masquerade of the Black Veil in 3 years, and the city's oldest families had spent that absence sharpening their knives in private. I wasn't supposed to be among them. I was Serafina Belante, a woman who spent her days bent over cracked varnish and flaking gold leaf, coaxing dead paintings back to life in a quiet studio on the east side. My name meant nothing in rooms like this. That was supposed to be my protection. One night, Leah had promised, sliding the black lace mask across my kitchen table like it was a peace offering instead of a curse. No one will know you. You'll dance, you'll drink champagne that costs more than your rent, and tomorrow you'll go back to your brushes and your boring, beautiful life. I should have said no. My father's name still echoed in rooms like the Vesperi ballroom. A name attached to unpaid debts and broken promises, a name that, if anyone recognized the shape of my face beneath the lace, would have gotten me escorted out by men with guns under their tuxedo jackets. But Leah had a way of making recklessness sound like therapy, and grief makes you reckless in ways you don't expect. My mother had been gone 8 months. I was tired of being careful, so I went. I let the mask hide me. I let the dress, black, fitted, slit to mid-thigh, turn me into someone who didn't flinch at chandeliers dripping crystal over 300 armed strangers in silk. The ballroom of the old Vesperi palace was exactly the kind of beautiful that makes your chest hurt. Velvet the color of dried wine. Candlelight instead of electric, because Dons apparently preferred their executions lit like romance novels. A string quartet played something dark and slow, and underneath it I could hear the particular silence of people who were all, every single one of them, watching each other for a reason to draw blood. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew that across the room, a man with hair so pale it looked silver under candlelight had gone very, very still. He wasn't watching me. Not at first. His gold eyes were tracking someone behind me, a man in a silver wolf mask who kept glancing at the exits like the floor might open beneath him. I didn't understand any of it. I was just a woman drifting through a crowd, looking for Leah, looking for an excuse to leave before the champagne wore off, and my nerve went with it. Then the wolf-masked man panicked. He shoved me. Hard, into the path of the pale-haired stranger, and disappeared into the crowd like smoke through a closed fist. I had 1/2 second to register the impact, a wall of muscle under tailored black, a hand closing around my bare shoulder with a grip that promised violence, before his mouth came down on my throat. Not a kiss. His teeth sank into the curve where my neck met my shoulder, deliberate and sharp, and pain bloomed bright and metallic before I understood what was happening. I heard myself gasp. I felt the warmth of blood sliding down my collarbone, staining the black lace at my chest. The music didn't stop. Nobody around us so much as turned their head, as if a man biting a stranger bloody in the middle of a ballroom was simply Tuesday in this world. He pulled back first. Gold eyes met mine through 2 masks, and for one suspended second, the most dangerous man I had ever stood near looked utterly, completely lost. "You're not," he started, voice low and rough, like he'd swallowed gravel. I didn't wait to hear the rest. Whatever I wasn't, I didn't want to find out what I was instead. I wrenched out of his grip, blood trailing hot down my skin, and ran. I didn't look back at the chandeliers or the silk or the man whose mouth had just marked me like a brand. I ran past Leah, who called my name and got only the back of my head for an answer. I ran through the gardens, past the cars, until I was 3 blocks away with my heels in my hand and my pulse going like a war drum. It was only in the back of a cab, pressing a tissue to my throat with shaking fingers, that I let myself look in my phone's camera two puncture-shaped marks, already bruising violet at the edges, sat just above my collarbone like a brand burned into porcelain. I told myself it was a freak accident, a drunk stranger, a bad night I'd laugh about in a year. I didn't yet know his name was Don Lucian Vesperi, the youngest, most feared head of an empire that didn't forgive mistakes, and that in his family, in the old blood-soaked superstitions his grandmother used to whisper, a bite like that wasn't an accident at all. It was a claim. And in the Vesperi bloodline, once you tasted what belonged to you, there was no walking it back. I didn't know that within 72 hours, his entire empire would be turned inside out looking for a woman in black lace. I only knew that my neck throbbed in time with my heartbeat the whole cab ride home, and that some small, foolish part of me didn't entirely hate the way it felt. Subscribe, Hook. If you're already leaning in, if some part of you wants to know what happens when the most dangerous man in the city realizes he's hunting the wrong kind of prey, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we go further. Trust me, the darkness only gets better from here. I went to bed that night, telling myself it was over. I woke up the next morning to a black town car parked outside my studio, and I understood, with the particular clarity of dread, that it had only just begun. My studio sat above a shuttered bookshop on a narrow street that smelled like turpentine and old paper, the kind of place no one with real money ever had reason to find. I told myself the car outside was a coincidence. Manhattan was full of black town cars. It meant nothing that this one idled there for 6 hours, engine running, 2 men in dark suits doing absolutely nothing except watching my door like it owed them money. By the second day, I'd stopped telling myself anything. I learned his name from Leah, who'd spent the morning after the Masquerade fielding panicked calls from half the women she knew. Don Lucian Vesperi, she said, voice tight over the phone. Sarah, do you understand who that is? He doesn't lose control, ever. People are saying he tore the ballroom apart looking for the traitor who got away and for the woman he bit by accident. They're saying he hasn't slept. He's had half the East Coast turned upside down in 3 days. It was an accident, I said, pressing my fingers to the now healing marks at my throat, as if I could argue the wound into meaning less than it did. He'll find the actual traitor and forget about it. Leah didn't answer right away, and her silence told me everything her words hadn't. That's not how the Vesperis work, she finally said. There's a story, an old one, about how Lucian's family marks people. Once it's done, it's done. You don't unmark a Vesperi bite, Sarah. He's not looking for an apology. He's looking for you. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, Mafia theater dressed up to sound romantic and dangerous. But superstition didn't explain the surveillance van that replaced the town car on day 4, or the florist who showed up at my studio door with an order he swore had been placed under my name. Black orchids, no card, no explanation, paid for in cash by a man matching a description I didn't want to hear. My life before the Masquerade had been small on purpose. After my father's debts collapsed what was left of our family 8 years ago, after creditors and men with quiet, threatening voices had circled our apartment like vultures, I'd built myself something deliberately unremarkable. A studio. A handful of clients who trusted me with paintings worth more than my entire existence. A reputation for discretion, because discretion was the only currency that had ever kept me safe. Now discretion meant nothing. Somewhere out there, a man who ran half the city's underworld had decided I was his, based on nothing but an accident of proximity and old blood, and I had no idea how to make myself invisible to someone who had unlimited resources and an obsession to match. I tried to keep working. I had a restoration due. Minor, a private collector's 19th century portrait with smoke damage along the lower edge, and losing myself in solvent and soft brushes had always been the one thing that quieted the noise in my head. but my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and twice I caught myself touching the faint scar at my throat like it was a phone ringing only I could hear. On the 5th night, someone left a single black orchid on my windowsill. 3rd floor. No fire escape on that side of the building. I didn't sleep at all after that. There was a particular kind of exhaustion in being watched without being touched. I started cataloging the men outside my window the way I catalog damage on a canvas, noting which ones rotated shifts at dawn, which ones lingered too long over coffee from the cart on the corner, which ones never once looked directly at my window because they didn't need to. I told myself it was research. It was really just fear, dressed up in a discipline I understood better than my own feelings. I called my landlord once, in a moment of weak hope, and asked if he'd noticed anything strange outside the building. He laughed, not unkindly, and told me half the block had been talking about the cars for days. Nobody dared call the police on men who looked like that. "Whatever you got mixed up in," he said, "you settle it quiet, or you settle it somewhere else. I can't have that kind of attention on my building." I didn't blame him. I would have said the same thing in his position. By the end of the first week, the surveillance had stopped pretending to be subtle. A woman I didn't recognize struck up conversation at my coffee shop and asked questions that circled too close to my father's name, my mother's death, the exact address of my studio. Questions dressed as small talk, but built like a dossier. I excused myself before she finished her coffee and didn't go back to that shop again. It was on day 9 that the envelope arrived. No postage, no address. Just my name, in handwriting so precise it looked engraved, sitting on my doormat like it had simply materialized there. Inside was a single line. "I know who you are, Serafina. I know what you do, who you loved, what you lost. I am not interested in punishing an accident. I am interested in you. You have until Friday to come to me on your own. After that, I come to you, and I promise you will not enjoy the difference." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. I sat on my studio floor with that note in my hands for a long time, my back against the work table, the faint scar on my neck aching like it remembered something my mind was still refusing to. I thought about running. I thought about the cousin in Vermont I hadn't spoken to in years, about disappearing the way my father always threatened to and never managed. But men like Lucian Vesperi didn't lose interest because their prey moved zip codes. And some small, traitorous part of me, the part that still remembered the way his gold eyes had looked stripped bare of control for one unguarded second, wanted to know what would happen if I stopped running and simply looked back. Friday came faster than I was ready for. I didn't go to him. He came to me instead, exactly as promised. And the moment his car pulled up outside my building, I understood that the life I'd built so carefully out of quiet rooms and other people's restored paintings was already irreversibly over. He didn't knock. Men like Lucian Vesperi didn't need to. I heard the building's front door open downstairs, heard the particular silence of more than one person climbing toward my studio with the unhurried confidence of men who'd never once worried about consequences. By the time my own door swung open, unlocked, because apparently locks were a courtesy he hadn't required, I was standing in the middle of the room with a palette knife in my hand, like it might do anything at all against what was walking toward me. He filled the doorway like he'd been carved to fit it. No mask this time. Just pale blonde hair pulled back from a face all sharp angles and barely restrained violence. Gold eyes that found the healing mark at my throat before they found my face, and an expression that flickered, just once, with something that looked dangerously close to relief. "Serafina Belante," he said, like he was confirming a fact he already knew bone deep. "It took my men 9 days to find a ghost. You're good at disappearing." "I wasn't trying to disappear from anyone. I was just living my life until you decided to bite a stranger at a party." Something almost like amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. That stranger sold 3 of my men to the Falcone family. He would have died for it tonight, cleanly, if he hadn't shoved an innocent woman into my path at the exact wrong second. He took a step further into my studio, and the room, which had always felt comfortably small, suddenly felt like it couldn't hold the 2 of us and the tension sitting between us both. I don't make mistakes, Miss Belante. I haven't, in 15 years of running this family. So you'll forgive me if I find it difficult to simply walk away from the one I made with you. It's not difficult. You just turn around and leave. I know about your father. The words landed like a slap, quiet and devastating. I know he owed money to 3 families before he disappeared and left you and your mother to answer for it. I know your mother died 8 months ago, and that the medical debt from her last year is still sitting unpaid in your name, accruing interest you'll never outrun on a restorer's income. I know you turned down 2 job offers because they required background checks that would have exposed exactly who your father was. He let that settle before he continued, voice dropping lower, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. I know everything about the life you've built to keep yourself small and safe, Serafina. And I am telling you, as a courtesy I extend to almost no one, that it isn't working. The Falcones already know who marked you. If I don't claim you properly, publicly, they will see you as a weakness to exploit, a way to wound me that doesn't involve a bullet. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. So what? Your solution is to claim me yourself, like I'm an asset to protect from a hostile takeover? My solution, he said, is an offer. I have a painting, a Vesperi family portrait, 4 generations old, with smoke and water damage from a fire no one in my family discusses. I need someone with your specific expertise to restore it. Someone outside the usual circles. Someone whose discretion isn't for sale. You'll work in my home, under my protection. Your mother's medical debt disappears the day you start. And no one, Falcone included, touches a woman working directly inside Vesperi walls. And if I say no, then I can't protect you from what comes next. And I think, Serafina, that you already understand exactly what that means. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. He never raised his voice, never moved closer than was necessary. But it didn't need to be a threat. It was simply true, laid out plainly between us, the way men like him built every transaction. Clean, undeniable, impossible to walk away from, without consequences I couldn't survive on my own. I thought about the surveillance van, the orchids on a windowsill 3 floors up, the woman at the coffee shop with too many careful questions. I thought about my mother's debt, a number I'd stopped letting myself look at directly because it made it hard to breathe. If I do this, I said slowly, I restore the painting. That's all. I'm not. Whatever it is you think I am to you, I'm not yours. Something flickered behind his gold eyes, there and gone, unreadable. Agreed, he said, in a tone that made the words sound like a formality neither of us believed. My car will be here at 8 tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you need for the work. Everything else you'll find already provided. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, and I stood alone in my studio for a long time afterward, palette knife still useless in my hand, staring at the door he'd closed behind him, with the unsettling sense that I had just agreed to something far larger than a restoration job, and that some treacherous corner of myself was already, helplessly, curious to find out what it was. Engagement question. If a man like Lucian showed up at your door with an offer like that, protection wrapped around a debt you couldn't refuse, would you have walked through that door or run the other way? Tell me honestly in the comments. I want to know if you're braver than I was. The Vesperi estate didn't look like a fortress from the outside. That was, I would learn, entirely intentional. Stone walls softened with ivy, a gravel drive lined with cypress trees, a house that could have belonged to old money anywhere in the world, except for the men stationed at intervals along the perimeter, dressed like groundskeepers and armed like soldiers, and the cameras tucked into ornamental stonework so discreetly I only noticed them because I was looking. A woman met the car before I'd even stepped fully out of it, tall, dark-haired, dressed in tailored navy that read as armor as much as fashion, with the same gold-flecked eyes as Lucian, though hers were cooler, more assessing. "Valeria Vesperi," she said, not extending a hand. "My brother's sister, his underboss, and the person who will be deciding within the week whether you're a liability or an asset. Try not to disappoint me." That's a warm welcome. I don't do warm, I do useful. But something in her assessment softened by a fraction as her gaze caught the faded mark at my throat, half hidden under my collar. "That's healing well. You're lucky. My brother doesn't bite without meaning it, even by accident." The painting waited for me in a private gallery on the estate's second floor. 4 generations of Vesperi men and women staring down from gilt frames, except for one section near the center where smoke and water had eaten through varnish and canvas alike, leaving a wound in the family's visual history that no one, apparently, had attempted to repair in decades. "It's beautiful," I said honestly, studying the damage with the part of my brain that always quieted everything else. "This kind of smoke staining, this deep, there was a real fire here, not just candle damage." "There was," Valeria said, voice gone careful. "Before my time. My grandfather never spoke of it. Lucian barely remembers it happening, only the aftermath. It was the first thread of something larger, though I didn't know it yet, just a loose edge of fabric that would, weeks later, unravel an entire family's worth of secrets. That night, alone in the guest wing they'd given me, a room larger than my entire studio apartment, with a 4-poster bed I felt absurd even sitting on, I found myself drawing the smoke-damage section of the painting from memory in my sketchbook, the way I always did with damage that bothered me past the point of professional curiosity. There was something underneath the staining that didn't read as accidental. Fires that started in fireplaces or candles scarred wood and stone in predictable patterns. This pattern wasn't predictable. It radiated from a single point on the canvas itself, like the painting had been the target, not the room around it. I didn't say anything yet. I wasn't sure what I'd be accusing anyone of, or why my hands had gone cold simply sketching it. My days fell into a rhythm I hadn't expected to find peace in. Mornings with the painting, hands steady with solvent and soft brushes, the particular meditation of bringing something ruined back into focus. Afternoons I tried to spend alone, though I quickly learned that alone, on Vesperi land, was a relative concept. Someone was always nearby, watching without seeming to, protecting without ever quite explaining what, exactly, they expected me to need protecting from. Lucian kept his distance during the first week, in the way a storm keeps its distance before it makes landfall. I'd catch him at the edge of rooms, gold eyes tracking my movement through his house with an intensity he didn't bother hiding. We didn't speak more than was necessary. I told myself that suited me fine. Then, on the 8th day, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. My mother's old apartment building, the one I'd been unable to fully close out after she died, the one tangled in debt I'd been too exhausted to fully untangle. The building's super told me, voice apologetic, that the unit's contents, the last of my mother's things, photographs, and her wedding ring and the handwritten recipes I hadn't had the heart to digitize, were scheduled for disposal in 72 hours, unless the outstanding storage fees were paid in full. I didn't have the money. I'd never had the money. That was the entire, humiliating point. I found Lucian in his study that evening, intending to ask for nothing, intending only to explain why I might need an afternoon away from the painting to go fight a losing battle with a storage company. I got 3 sentences into the explanation before he held up a hand, already reaching for his phone. "Address," he said simply. I wasn't asking you to fix this." "I know you weren't. That's precisely why I'm going to." He made the call in front of me, voice clipped and businesslike, resolving in under 2 minutes a debt that had been crushing me in slow motion for the better part of a year. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not possession, not hunger, but something quieter and more dangerous. Genuine attention. "Your mother's things will be in storage at my expense, indefinitely, until you're ready to deal with them on your own terms, not mine." "Why would you do that?" "Because no one has been taking care of you," he said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "And I find that I would like to be the exception." I went to bed that night with my chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the terrifying, traitorous realization that I owed this man something now that had nothing to do with money, and that some part of me didn't entirely mind the debt. The painting's restoration brought me, 2 weeks in, to a private dinner I hadn't been warned about. A quiet gathering of allied families in the estate's East Wing, the kind of event where alliances were measured in seating arrangements and unspoken debts. Valeria found me in the gallery that afternoon and informed me, without room for negotiation, that my presence was required. "You're the woman restoring the Vesperi legacy," she said. "That makes you part of tonight's optics, whether you like it or not." I didn't like it. I went anyway, in a dress Valeria's staff had produced from somewhere, deep green silk that made the healing mark at my throat look deliberate instead of accidental. The dinner itself blurred into careful conversation and careful silences, until a man I didn't recognize, older, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes, introduced himself as an associate of the Falcone family, and spent 10 uncomfortable minutes asking me questions that circled, again too close to things he had no business knowing. My father's debts, my mother's death. How exactly a restorer had ended up so deep inside Vesperi walls. I excused myself before my composure cracked, retreating to the empty terrace off the gallery, gulping cold air like it could undo the tightness in my chest. I hadn't realized how much I'd been holding myself together by sheer will until the cold air hit my face and my hands started shaking in a way they hadn't even during the worst of the surveillance. It wasn't just the man's questions. It was the realization, sitting heavy in my stomach, that I had stopped being merely an inconvenience to the Falcones and had become, somehow, a target worth studying, a piece on a board I hadn't agreed to play on, moved by rules no one had bothered to explain to me. Lucian found me there within minutes. "Antonio Falcone sent that man tonight specifically to unsettle you," he said, closing the terrace door behind him, sealing out the noise of the dinner like he was sealing out the rest of the world entirely. "He's testing whether you're a weakness he can exploit." "Is that what I am? A weakness?" "You're the only thing in 15 years that's made me lose a single second of control." He moved closer, and the terrace, large as it was, suddenly felt impossibly small. "I have spent 2 weeks telling myself that what happened at the Masquerade was an accident I needed to manage, contain, correct. I have failed completely." "Lucian, tell me to stop," he said, voice rough, "and I will turn around and walk back inside, and I will never raise the subject again." I didn't tell him to stop. His hand came up to frame my jaw, gentle in a way that didn't match the violence I knew lived under his composure. And when he kissed me, it wasn't the brutal claiming of the Masquerade. It was slow, deliberate, restrained in a way that somehow undid me more thoroughly than force ever could have, his mouth moving over mine like he was relearning something he'd been starving for since the night he'd marked me by accident. I felt the ghost of his teeth against my lower lip, careful this time, asking instead of taking, and something in my chest that had been braced for impact for 2 weeks finally, dangerously, gave way. I kissed him back. I let my hands find the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away, and for one suspended, terrifying moment, I forgot every reason I had to be afraid of this man. It was the sound of the terrace door opening, Valeria clearing her throat with deliberate volume, that broke us apart. I stepped back, breath unsteady, heat climbing up my throat that had nothing to do with embarrassment, and everything to do with how thoroughly I'd just stopped thinking. "The Falcone associate is leaving," Valeria said, gaze flicking between us with an expression I couldn't read. "And Lucian, we need to talk. Now." He left without another word to me, though his eyes held mine for one last second, gold and unguarded, before he disappeared back into the house. I stood alone on the terrace for a long time afterward, fingers pressed to lips still warm from his mouth, trying and failing to convince myself that what had just happened was a mistake I could walk back. The same lie I'd told myself about the bite, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. Whatever Valeria pulled Lucian away to discuss that night, neither of them spoke of it directly. But the house's temperature shifted afterward, a tension running underneath every conversation like a current I could feel, but not name. It was 3 days later, working alone in the gallery, that I found the first piece of it myself. The damaged section of the painting had been hiding more than smoke staining. As I worked the solvent deeper into the canvas, carefully lifting decades of soot, a second layer revealed itself beneath the surface. Not damage, but deliberate overpainting. Someone, long ago, had painted over a section of the original portrait. Beneath it, faint but undeniable, I could make out the edge of a second figure standing beside the Vesperi patriarch in the original composition, a figure that had been erased from the family's visual history entirely. I brought my findings to Lucian that evening, half expecting him to dismiss it as an old restoration error. Instead, he went very still, the way he had at the Masquerade, right before everything changed. "My grandfather had a brother," he said slowly, like he was excavating a memory he hadn't touched in years. "No one in my family speaks of him. I was told he died young. I was never told how or why his portrait would have been painted over." "The fire," I said. Valeria mentioned a fire, before her time. What if the fire and the overpainting are connected? What if someone wanted both erased? It was Valeria, summoned to the gallery and shown the exposed second figure, who finally broke the silence that had clearly sat unspoken in this family for 2 generations. "His name was Matteo," she said quietly. "Our grandfather's younger brother. The story I was told, as a child, in pieces no one wanted to fully explain. He fell in love with a woman from a rival family, a Falcone, before the Falcones were what they are now. When it was discovered, the fire happened. Matteo died in it. The woman vanished. No one in this family has said her name aloud in 50 years. What was her name?" I asked, though some instinct in my chest already knew, with the cold certainty of inevitability, what the answer would be. "Belante," Valeria said. "Her name was Isabetta Belante." I thought in that moment of every time my father had gone silent at the mention of family history, every photograph he'd kept locked away in a box I was never allowed to open, every time he'd flinched at the word fire without ever explaining why. I had spent my whole life believing his silence was shame over debt and failure. I understood now it had been grief wearing the costume of shame, passed down to him the way some families pass down good china, carefully, and without ever explaining what it was actually worth. The room tilted. My grandmother's name, the woman my father had spoken of only twice in my life, always with a strange, bitter grief I'd never understood, had been Isabetta. I had never known her last name before her marriage. I had never known, because my father never let me ask, why my family's history seemed to begin abruptly, severed, with no roots visible before it. My grandmother, I said, voice barely above a whisper. I think your Matteo was my grandmother's first love. I think the fire that erased him from your family's portrait is the same fire my father's debts and silence were built on top of, 50 years later, without either of us ever knowing it. Lucian's gold eyes found mine across the gallery, something shifting behind them. Recognition, inevitability, the unsettling sense that the masquerade hadn't been an accident at all, but the closing of a circle that had been spinning, unresolved, for half a century. You were never a stranger I marked by mistake, he said quietly. You were always going to end up inside these walls, Serafina. The blood was always going to find its way back. Engagement question. If you found out your bloodline had been tangled with your enemies for 50 years before you ever set foot in their world, would it make you trust the pull between you more, or trust it less? Drop your answer below. I'm genuinely curious where you land. Knowledge, I learned quickly, was not the same as safety. If anything, the discovery of Matteo and Isabetta made me more dangerous to know, not less. A living thread connecting two families' oldest wound, walking around inside Vesperi walls with the one piece of leverage Antonio Falcone hadn't realized existed until now. He reached out directly 4 days later. Not through an associate this time, a handwritten note delivered to the gallery by a courier who vanished before security could intercept him, the paper itself smelling faintly of cigar smoke and certainty. Miss Bellante, it read. You restore paintings for a living, but you've stumbled into restoring something far larger, a 50-year wound between our families. I imagine the Vesperies haven't told you that Isabetta didn't simply vanish after the fire. She was protected by my family, hidden, given a new life and a new name, in exchange for a debt that was never fully repaid. Your father inherited that debt and ran from it, leaving you to inherit it after him. I am prepared to forgive what remains of it entirely. In exchange for one conversation, away from Vesperi ears. Come alone. You'll understand far more about your own history than Lucian has any interest in telling you. I didn't go to him, but I didn't burn the note either, and that hesitation alone told me how deeply the ground had shifted beneath me. Over the following days, Falcone's pressure grew quieter and more insidious rather than louder. A name dropped at a charity gala Valeria mentioned in passing, a rumor that reached me secondhand about a restorer who'd gone soft, working too closely with dangerous men, the kind of whisper campaign designed to isolate me from anyone outside Vesperi walls who might have once vouched for my judgment. I understood with growing unease that he wasn't simply trying to extract information from me. He was trying to make sure that if I ever did walk away from Lucian, I'd have nowhere left to land. Valeria found me staring at it in the gallery an hour later, expression unreadable as she read it over my shoulder without asking permission. He's not lying about the debt, she said finally. I made calls after we found Isabetta's portrait. The Falcones did shelter her after the fire. Whatever agreement was made, your father inherited the consequences of it, whether he understood the history behind it or not. Why didn't Lucian tell me this? Because my brother is many things, Serafina, but he is not always wise about the difference between protecting you and controlling the version of events you're allowed to know. Valeria's gaze sharpened, assessing me with the same cool calculation she'd used the day I arrived. I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you here because you've fallen for my brother? Or because you've fallen for the safety he's offering a woman who has never, in her entire life, had anyone offer to protect her from anything? The question landed harder than I expected, because I didn't have a clean answer for it. I thought about the bite at the Masquerade, the kiss on the terrace, the way Lucian's attention made me feel seen for the first time since my mother died. And I thought, too, about how seamlessly that attention had arrived, wrapped around debt relief and danger, and an offer I'd never truly been free to refuse. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know if I can tell the difference anymore. Then find out, Valeria said, not unkindly, because Falcone is going to keep pulling at that thread until you do, and my brother's obsession will not protect you from a war he's too close to see clearly. You need to decide, soon, whether you're choosing him or simply surviving him. That night, lying awake in the room that had become mine without my ever quite agreeing to it, I finally let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding since the Masquerade, whether the painting, the debt, the bite, the kiss had ever been mine to choose, or whether I had simply been the last unclaimed piece in a war that started 50 years before I was born. I went back to the painting the next morning with new eyes, no longer just a restorer chasing aesthetic damage, but a woman searching for the truth her own family had buried under decades of silence. If Matteo and Isabetta's story had been painted over once, deliberately, by someone with a reason to erase it, I needed to know what else that someone had been protecting. It took 2 more days of careful work, lifting layers no restoration brief had ever asked me to lift, before I found it, tucked behind the canvas itself, sealed between the original fabric and a second backing added decades later, a thin oilskin packet that had survived fire, time, and 50 years of silence completely intact. Inside were letters, Isabetta's handwriting, achingly familiar in its slant and pressure to my own grandmother's hand on the few recipe cards I still owned, and beneath the letters, a ledger page, old, water-stained, but legible, documenting payments made not to Isabetta for her protection, as Falcone's note had claimed, but from Antonio Falcone's own grandfather to the man who set the fire that killed Matteo Vesperi. I sat on the gallery floor for nearly an hour after I understood what I was holding, the oilskin packet trembling in my hands, running my fingers over ink that had survived 50 years of silence to land, against every reasonable odd in mine. There was a strange grief in it, mourning a grandmother I'd never properly known, a great uncle by circumstance I'd never have the chance to meet, a love story that had been murdered and then rewritten by the very family now trying to use it against me. I understood, sitting there, that I wasn't just restoring a painting anymore. I was the last living person who could finish a story 2 families had spent 50 years trying to forget. The fire hadn't been an accident, or a tragedy born of forbidden love discovered. It had been arranged, paid for. A calculated strike against the Vesperi family disguised for 50 years as a romance gone wrong. And the debt my father had inherited, the one Antonio Falcone now dangled in front of me as leverage, wasn't a debt for protecting Isabetta at all. It was hush money, payment, passed down through generations to keep my family quiet about what the Falcones had actually done. My hands shook as I read it a second time, then a third, the full shape of it settling into place with a cold, clarifying horror. Antonio Falcone wasn't reaching out to forgive an old debt out of mercy. He was reaching out because if this ledger ever surfaced, it would expose his family's foundational crime to every ally the Falcones had, and unravel 50 years of carefully maintained mythology in a single afternoon. I brought everything to Lucian that night, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something colder and more dangerous as he read his own family's true history laid bare in faded ink. My grandfather spent his entire life believing his brother died for love. he said quietly, voice carrying a grief I hadn't expected from him. He mourned a tragedy, not a murder. There's more, I said, steadying my voice with effort. Falcone reached out to me directly. He offered to forgive my father's debt if I met him alone, away from you. I think he knows this ledger exists somewhere, even if he doesn't know exactly where, and he's been trying to control me before I could find it. Something settled in Lucian's expression then. Not the wild, possessive fury I might have expected, but something quieter and more lethal. Calculation. Then we don't go to him with anger, he said. We go to him with proof, publicly, in front of every family whose alliance he's relied on for 50 years to keep this buried. That's dangerous. Everything about this family is dangerous, Serafina. The only question is whether we control the danger or let it keep controlling us. He reached for my hand then, gold eyes holding mine with a steadiness that finally, fully answered the question Valeria had asked me days earlier. Whether this had ever been about obsession or about something steadier underneath it. You didn't have to bring this to me. You could have taken Falcone's offer, erased your father's debt, walked away from all of this completely. You chose to hand me the one thing that could burn his entire empire down instead. I chose you, I said, and understood as I said it that it was finally, simply true. Not the safety, not the debt relief, you. His mouth found mine again, slower this time, steadier. A promise instead of a claim. And somewhere underneath the fear of what came next, I felt something settle into place that had been unsteady since the moment his teeth first found my throat. The certainty that whatever happened with Falcone, I wasn't facing it as prey anymore. I was facing it as the woman who'd found the proof that could end him. Lucian called the meeting for 3 nights later, a gathering of allied families at neutral ground, the kind of summit usually reserved for treaties and truces, dressed up with enough ceremony that Falcone couldn't refuse the invitation without admitting weakness. I stood beside Lucian as the families filed into the same kind of gilded room I'd first seen him in, months and a lifetime ago. The ledger and Isabetta's letters secured in a leather folio I held against my chest like armor. Antonio Falcone arrived smiling, confident, clearly expecting the meeting to be about brokering peace between his family and mine through whatever leverage he believed he still held. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Lucian to nod at me. I stepped forward into a room full of armed strangers, my pulse a war drum I refused to let show on my face, and laid the truth out exactly as I'd found it. The overpainted figure, the ledger entry, Isabetta's letters describing a love story Falcone's family had murdered, and then rewritten into a tragedy of star-crossed romance to hide their own guilt. I watched the color drain from Antonio Falcone's face in real time as 50 years of carefully maintained mythology collapsed in front of every ally whose loyalty he'd built on top of it. "This is fabrication," he said too loudly, the kind of denial that convinces no one. "A restorer's fantasy, designed to manipulate. The ledger is in your grandfather's own handwriting," I said, voice steady despite everything in me that wanted to shake. "I've had it authenticated independently, dated and verified. Alongside the original Vesperi portrait, it was hidden inside for 50 years. Every family in this room can have copies by morning, if you'd like to keep arguing about its authenticity." It was Valeria, stepping up beside me with the cold composure of a woman who'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this moment, who delivered the final blow. "You tried to use my family's grief as a weapon against an innocent woman," she said, voice carrying clean across the room. "You tried to buy her silence with the same money your family used to buy ours 50 years ago. The only question left for everyone in this room is whether you intend to keep believing your own lies after tonight, or whether you intend to step aside before the rest of your alliances learn exactly what you built your empire on top of. Falcone's men shifted, hands twitching toward weapons that would have started a war none of the gathered families wanted, but Lucian's voice cut through the tension before it could ignite. "No blood tonight," he said, gold eyes hard as struck flint. "The truth has done what blood couldn't. Antonio Falcone's word is worth nothing in this room anymore, and every family here knows it. That's a worse sentence than any bullet I could give him." It was, I would learn over the following weeks, exactly the right kind of ending. Not a war that would have cost lives on both sides, but a quiet, total collapse of credibility that left Falcone's alliances crumbling one by one, his empire shrinking under the weight of a truth that had waited 50 years to surface. No bodies, no funerals, just consequence, delivered the way Lucian preferred to deliver it. Clean, undeniable, impossible to walk back. My father's debt, the one that had shaped my entire adult life around careful smallness and fear, dissolved along with it, not forgiven by Falcone's mercy, but exposed for the blood money it had always been, void the moment its true nature became public record among the families who mattered. In the days that followed, I watched the city's careful architecture of fear reorganize itself around what had happened. Families who had once treated Falcone's word as currency now treated it as a liability. 2 allied houses formally severed ties before the week was out. There was no funeral, no procession, no blood spilled on marble. Just the slow, public unmaking of a man who had spent 50 years building an empire on a lie, undone by the granddaughter of the woman his family had wronged. I understood then why Lucian had insisted on truth over violence. Violence would have made me a casualty in someone else's war. Truth made me the reason it ended. Lucian found me on the terrace afterward, the same terrace where he'd first kissed me weeks earlier, and this time, when his hand found my jaw, there was no hesitation in either of us. "You walked into a room full of armed men and unmade an empire with a folio of paper," he said, something like wonder in his voice. "I have spent 15 years building my reputation on fear. You just taught this entire family that the right kind of truth is more dangerous than any gun I own." "I didn't do it for your reputation." "I know." His mouth curved, gold eyes warm in a way I'd never seen on him before tonight. "You did it because somewhere between a bite that should never have happened and a painting that should never have been overpainted, you stopped being a woman I claimed by accident and became the only thing in this family's 50-year history that anyone actually chose. Freely, on purpose." He kissed me then, slow and certain, under a sky finally clear of the smoke that had hung over both our families for half a century, and for the first time since a stranger's teeth had found my throat in a crowded ballroom, I understood that the mark on my skin had never been an accident at all. It had simply been the beginning of a story that needed both of us, broken history and all, to finally end the way it was always supposed to. 6 months later, the portrait hangs fully restored in the Vesperi Gallery, Matteo and Isabetta standing side by side again, finally, after 50 years of erasure. I still work in that gallery most mornings, though these days it's by choice instead of debt, and Lucian still finds reasons to interrupt me with the kind of attention I've stopped pretending I don't crave. We never found out who shoved that wolf-masked traitor into Lucian's path at the Masquerade, the mistake that started all of this. Some nights, I think it doesn't matter. Whatever set it in motion, the truth underneath it had been waiting 50 years to surface either way. And I'd like to think Isabetta would have been glad to know her granddaughter finally finished the story she never got to. If you made it all the way to the end with me, thank you for sitting in the dark a little longer tonight. If this story kept you up later than you meant to stay, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's always another mask, another secret, Another dangerous man waiting in the shadows of this city. Until next time, my darling shadows. Sleep well, if you can.